Uh, I'm Anil Deolalekar. I'm the founding dean of the School of Public Policy here at UC Riverside. Those of you who are from UCR know that we are a very new school. We just got started a couple of years back. And today we are going to, we would very much like to welcome you all to a special event that we are co-hosting with the PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California, and the California Endowment on Who Speaks for California, Political Participation, Youth Engagement, and Racial Disparities. This is actually not the first time that our School of Public Policy, even though it's just a couple of years old, has co-hosted an event with the Public Policy Institute of California. Just last year, we held an event on the demographic and economic future of the Inland Empire. And before that, we held another joint event with them on climate change. In addition, we have collaborated with PPIC in other ways and other capacities. Our very own Associate Dean, Karthik Ramakrishnan, whom I'll be introducing a little bit later on, was actually, he started off his career as a research fellow at PPIC before we, and an adjunct fellow. And you are currently an adjunct fellow there. As far as, yes, if Mark says you are, then you are. And so we have old ties to PPIC. Two of our other faculty members who couldn't be present here tonight are actually adjunct fellows at PPIC's Water Policy Center, Professor Kurt Schwabe and Professor Ken Barenklau. So it's an honor for us to collaborate with PPIC, and we look forward to other collaborations in the future. So as just a little spiel for our School of Public Policy here before I introduce the speakers in the first session, in the panel session. The School of Public Policy is focused on addressing the big challenges facing inland Southern California and California in general. We sort of distinguish ourselves from other schools of public policy in Southern California in that we focus on solving the big challenges facing Southern California, whether those challenges relate to climate change, immigration, justice reform, criminal justice reform, water scarcity, and what have you. But we focus on solving these challenges, addressing these big challenges facing California, using lessons from around the nation and around the world. So this emphasis on think globally, act locally, or act regionally is something we really try to imbibe in our students. And some of these challenges that I just mentioned a minute ago are the ones that will be the topic of discussion this afternoon. At today's event, we will bring up a panel of experts for a conversation about political participation along racial lines. That will be followed by a Q&A in which all of you are encouraged to participate. Then we will have a presentation on youth engagement, highlighting themes from the PPIC statewide surveys on millennials. And finally, we'll bring up a panel of experts from various community-based organizations to discuss what they are seeing from the youth movement in terms of voter and civic engagement. We will also have a Q&A at the conclusion of the panel discussion. So I ask that you please hold off your questions until we begin our Q&A session. Before I, well, I guess I should probably, since we started a little late, I should probably get to introducing our first set of panelists, and I don't know, maybe the panelists would like to come and sit at the table here. Mark Baldassare is President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California, where he holds the R.J. and Francis Fearing Miller Chair in Public Policy. He is a leading expert on public opinion and survey methodology and has directed the PPIC statewide survey since 1998. He is an authority on elections, voter behavior, and political and fiscal reform, authoring 10 books and numerous reports on these topics. Before he joined PPIC, he was a professor of planning at UC Irvine, and in fact, he launched the program in planning at UC Irvine, which has grown to be one of the best programs of its kind in the country, if not in California, certainly, if not the country. Karthik Ramakrishnan, sitting to Mark's left, is Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at UC Riverside, where he also serves as Associate Dean of the School of Public Policy. So Karthik mentioned to me that this evening event is one where his former boss and his current boss are both going to be present. Of course, the bosses shared some discussion amongst themselves, and they said that it often seems that Karthik is our boss sometimes. So Karthik is a born leader. As all of you know, he's out there sometimes literally working 24 hours a day on his research, on leading important initiatives in the state and nationally, as well as trying to work on administrative issues here in the School of Public Policy. His research focuses on civic participation, immigration policy, and the politics of race, ethnicity, and immigration in the United States. He directs the National Asian American Survey and is founder of AAPIdata.com, which seeks to make policy-relevant data on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders more accessible to a variety of audiences. In fact, if you read the New York Times last Sunday, he was quoted, the data that they use was quoted. This was a piece on how Asian Americans are sort of changing their party affiliations lately. And finally, last but not least, to Karthik's left, serving as moderator is Margarita Luna, who is also very familiar to us in the School of Public Policy. We have done some work together with her organization. She's from the California Endowment. She joined the California Endowment in June 2007 as program manager for communities in the Eastern Coachella Valley under the Endowment's 10-year Building Healthy Communities initiative. She manages a grant portfolio focused on improving community health through community engagement in policy advocacy and systems change. So let's give our first set of panelists a warm round of applause. And with that, I'm going to pass the podium on to you.
Thank you, Anil, and I think we need to turn that on. So we're going to try to keep this. It's kind of the end of the day. I think we wanted to make this a bit more interactive, and also just it's very meaningful for me to have Mark here. Just that was the first shop that I got out of grad school, but Mark was also a collaborator on a report which surprisingly has legs. People still ask us about it, right? And it was one of the first in California to draw attention not only to racial disparities in voting, but to look at other types of activities that also matter in terms of having voice, having influence, having a seat at the table, being a meaningful part of decision making. And so it was great to partner on that project. And Mark and I always say it'd be great to do something like that again. He's much more busy than I am. But it's great to have this forum where we can talk about what we've done since then, respectively, PPIC and what we're doing more recently here at UCR in terms of advancing that conversation. So we don't have any PowerPoint presentations, although Dean later will, in terms of the youth findings. But we primarily, I think, are going to have a initial set of remarks and dialogue, and then Margarita's going to jump in and break up the party and say, okay, let's talk about some real stuff. So I think maybe the first thing, Mark, is to just talk about the exclusive electorate and what that means. Why is it important for us to grapple with that concept?
Well, first of all, thanks for being here and inviting us here, Dina and I. PPIC is very proud to be affiliated with the work of this School of Public Policy, which I'm very impressed with. There have been great public policy leaders who have come out of UC Riverside already. And I know, I'm confident with the leadership of the school and the people who have been attracted to this program that there'll be even more. When I was in Washington not too long ago, I was in Congressman Mark Takano's office, and he had a chart which sort of laid out all of the leaders in California now who were from UC Riverside, and it was very impressive. Of course, our Assembly Speaker now, the Assembly member who's the head of the Higher Education Committee, the Congressman. There's just a number of people, and I just know that there'll be even more in the future coming out of this program. So my interest in the California exclusive electorate started pretty soon after Karthik and I co-authored the piece, which was based on the dissertation work that Karthik had done on political participation and race and ethnicity and immigration. And as somebody who does public opinion polling, whenever I look at a poll, I look to see if we have a representative sample, right? Do the adults who we're interviewing, do they look like what we know about the adult population? So, we do 8 or 9 polls a year at the Institute, and we do polls of adults, so we look at adults, and we look at registered voters, and we look at likely voters. And I was struck by the fact that the likely voter sample was not representative of the adult population. And I started to think about what that meant, in real terms. We know that there are millions of people who aren't registered to vote for a variety of reasons. Some of them are eligible. Some of them are citizens who are eligible to vote. Some of them are non-citizens who are eligible to be citizens who aren't citizens. Some of them are undocumented, and they are in limbo right now because they don't have the ability to become legal non-citizens and find a path to citizenship. In any case, with the millions of people, I realize it's not just the numbers; it's who is represented among the people who don't vote, and who is represented among the people who do vote. In our democracy in California, this isn't just about electing representatives, because, well, maybe we could think about the fact that, well, you might live in an area in which there are many people who don't vote, but you have a representative who has a good sense of what the needs of the population are. Well, that's only part of the way that public policy is made in our state. A major way that public policy is made is through the initiative process. So that means that that people who are voting in elections, we have 17 state propositions this November, for example, will be determining the types of spending and taxes and services and public policies that apply to everybody who lives here. So that's a big responsibility for those who are registered and will participate in elections. Now, if it turned out that the people who were the likely voters in California had the same policy preferences as the people who don't vote, then we might say, well, okay, at least those views and perspectives are being represented. But what I discovered a few years after working with Karthik was that there are a lot of needs that are mentioned, that are reflected among the people who don't vote in California, that are different. And there are a lot of policy preferences that are different. And that's what I wrote about 10 years ago in the first California's Exclusive Electorate. And that's what I revisited in the piece that came out earlier this year. And every time we do a poll, that's what I look at in California. In some of the polling we've done this year on issues having to do with spending, with taxes, with things that are going to the ballot, there are views and perspectives that the people who don't vote have that won't be reflected in our elections. And that's something that I know, and it's something that troubles me from a public policy perspective, and it's something that I'd like to share with you in some detail here tonight. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to, because we got started late, I'm going to try to keep some of these remarks brief and then just hand it over to you, Margarita. In terms of, it's interesting for me to come back to this research, and I kind of, I guess everything kind of happens for a reason. It's interesting. I did the research on civic engagement in PPIC, so not just the stuff on voting, but some of the earliest research on city-level policies towards immigrants. And in many ways, it was kind of a forerunner to the kind of research I ended up doing later in terms of local and state laws, many of them ending up being punitive, like what Arizona was doing, and then what California is doing more recently, which is pretty progressive. And then I did all this, started doing survey work on Asian Americans. In some ways, learning from the master, I guess, in some ways, right? But more recently, the Advancement Project reached out to both Mark and me to say, would you have interest in reviving that study to look at activities beyond voting? Mark didn't have the bandwidth to do it, and I said, sure, let's talk about it. Let's see if we can do this. I'd be interested to see if anything has changed since when we did that study more than a decade ago. And Advancement Project's been a great partner. So both with the endowment and the Advancement Project, I did not know who these organizations are. I thought California Endowment is a health organization. I didn't really understand what it has to do with power, right? But as you can see, a lot of the work that the endowment does is about empowering disadvantaged communities, and it's so impressive, the work they do. I say this, I should say this as disclosure, is I was invited to join the board of the California Endowment a couple of months ago, and it was totally out of the blue. I did not expect it. Like I said, like a year ago, I didn't even know what the endowment really did. But learning about the work that they do and to see empowerment. So, I mean, VOTA is a big part of their campaign, but when you talk to the folks on the ground, they realize that voting is one component in a larger strategy, right? And some people would say it's organizing, and yeah, it is organizing, right? But it's organizing in a very kind of systematic and thoughtful way, and to think comprehensively about health, which is really fascinating. The report that we did with Advancement Project analyzes existing data, which is to say it's limited. Since PPIC did their work, there haven't been other statewide survey collections, except for the current population survey. So that's something that's actually was an advancement. Starting in 2008, there were some interesting data collections happening in the current population survey on volunteerism, other types of civic engagement, like attending political meetings, contacting public officials. Now, it's great to have some of that data, but unfortunately, the CPS does not ask it regularly anymore. And so there's a big void. So one of the things that from the ongoing work that I and our team here is doing with Advancement Project is to start having this conversation with funders, with researchers, and even with communities on the ground. If we know that voting equality is an important goal to attain, but we know that there are these other things that matter, and there are funders that care. They talk about integrated voter engagement and how there are all these other activities between elections that matter, and yet we don't have any good measure of that. that's a problem, right? So when it comes to voting, just because we measure something doesn't mean we have the problem solved, and we know that with voting in California. But there are interventions now, like with automated voter registration, that should help, and at least in the future draw attention to other aspects of the voting process, like get out the vote efforts, which will be more important with people that get automated registration. But it's so important to start thinking about how we can get local jurisdictions to start collecting data on who shows up to meetings, who contacts city government, what that experience is like. So in the course of having these conversations, there's some exciting ideas. I was just in Sacramento at UC Center Sacramento, kind of testing out some of these ideas, and people come up with new ideas of trying to come up with measures of this, all with an eye to improving the current situation in California, which, from all we can tell, just because people don't have to be citizens in order to contact elected officials or attend public hearings. And we may have individual examples, especially of, say, undocumented youth that are empowered. I see Tom Dolan's shirt of being woke, right? Like people that are like, we know, kind of very inspiring examples. But if you actually look at the systematic evidence, people who are not empowered at the ballot box are even less empowered in these other political activities. And that's a huge area of concern. So I think that's the challenge before us. It's an opportunity and a challenge, and especially in the context of California is now majority Latino and Asian American. And those trends are just going to continue in the future. And yet these groups are the ones that are least likely to be engaged and empowered. That's a problem for California. Not just for these communities, it's a problem for our communities broadly speaking, our local governments, county governments, state government.
Thank you. And I know that Karthik mentioned that he is my boss too, so I just want to make that clear as well. So I'm not going to throw him any softballs. But I think for me, one of the things that came out very clearly from both of your pieces is really about how this divide continues to exist when you control for education, when you control for income. And so I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about what got us here. Like, what is the root cause? As a public health professional, I'm really curious to understand what's underlying this and what is the root cause of this disparity that we're talking about today.
Well, I think there are a lot of things, but let me just mention something that I observed. There was different emphasis on my report in 2006 from the report in 2016. The report in 2006, to me, was very much influenced by the racial and ethnic change that was occurring in the state. The report in 2016 very much, and the trends very much influenced by the trends in income inequality that have taken place in the last 10 years, especially since the Great Recession. So when I look at all the reasons why those patterns that we saw 10 years ago are as troubling, if not more troubling, and stubbornly present today, it has to do with the level of poverty and income inequality that exists in our society today, and raising a fundamental question for me about, well, what can public policy do to address that, and how much can we expect to accomplish in terms of improving rates of civic participation and voter engagement if we don't make more progress in reducing income inequality.
One thing I'll add to that, I mean, this thing about root causes, it's great. I mean, we teach that in policy school too, right? So, and certainly income inequality, and even that, the thing with root causes, you can still keep digging deeper. One thing I would like to flag on top of income inequality and poverty, economic disadvantage, I mean, that's so central now to our concerns. I mean, even more so during the primary process when you had Sanders and Clinton kind of are debating that within the Democratic Party. That was an interesting conversation to have within the party itself. But on top of that, I mean, if you look at, there are intentioned and well-meaning officials, especially at the local level, who want community participation. But if you actually look at the way local decision-making is often structured, having elections off cycle, which PPIC has sponsored research on that to show that makes a huge difference in terms of whether people participate or not. So there are things like that, and even when meetings get held, where it's not clear that decision makers always want the public to be involved. In fact, they probably think that the public is a pain on some of these decisions. And so there are ways to have public participation that are probably not helpful, but there are examples of pilot programs or jurisdictions that come up with innovations to make sure that they engage in ways that are mutually beneficial, that it's not necessarily an antagonistic relationship, or even if it's antagonistic, that ultimately what comes out of that is something that's good for the community.
I've also been struck by the number of public policy that have been addressing voters, right? Or at least voter registration, right? So we have the motor voter law. We have SB 450 that was just passed about voting centers, right? And then there's also SB 2466, which gave those that are incarcerated in county jails the ability to vote. And so yet, with all of that, we're still seeing in your report, Mark, in terms of how will that impact voting and voter turnout. And so I'm curious, like, what are other ways that that those that are here in the audience, as well as elected officials out there, policymakers, can really begin to address how do we get people out to vote as well?
I think that's a great question, and we've made a lot of progress in terms of actually making it easier for people to register to vote. And the Secretary of State came out with new voter registration numbers today. You probably saw them. I was very interested in the fact that since our report, which used early 2016, we have about 1 million new registered voters in California. That's very good. And when I did a program with our Secretary of State when he was running for office, and I asked him, what is your goal? He said 1 million new voters by, I thought, well, you made your goal in terms of the voter registration, and that's terrific. I will point out that that even those numbers, it's uneven. So if you dig a little deeper into the Riverside San Bernardino numbers, you'll be interested in this, is that below the statewide average in terms of, significantly below the statewide average in terms of the voter registration of eligible adults in Riverside San Bernardino today, and we have a lot of work to do on the statewide level. So I personally think that it's not just making it easier to vote, it's making it meaningful for people to vote. And that means civics education, and there's got to be some levels of civic participation along the way besides voting that will give people a sense that, these activities that have to do with interactions with government actually can make a difference in their lives. Because one of the things we learned from our polling is that a lot of people who say that, who we know will be automatically registered or, will be registering, they are low propensity voters unless they have some experiences in their lives that tell them that this is going to be worth doing a few times a year.
So I think we're out of time for this panel. Yeah, but maybe when we open it up at the end to a more general Q&A, we can chime in. But thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah, this is great. And clearly a lot more to talk about.
So I want to bring up Dean Bono, who is from the Public Policy Institute of California. Sorry, Amy, yes, you can clap.
Hi, I will try to make sure that I'm courteous with my timing, given that we are a little behind schedule. So today, I will be speaking to, let's see if this works. There we go. Today we'll be speaking to you about millennials in California. And while I'm not a millennial myself, I do work with two of them in close confines. So I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of this group of folks that are becoming increasingly popular among researchers and important among policy discussions. And so just real quickly to tell you a little bit about the PPIC statewide survey. The mission of the survey is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions of all Californians, not just registered voters or likely voters. We're looking to inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. It provides a voice for all Californians on important state policy debates. And since 1998, we've interviewed over 325,000 Californians, nearly 350,000 right now, in over 150 surveys on general issues as well as some regional surveys that we used to do as well. So the data I'm going to be presenting today is from most of the data is from 7 PPIC statewide surveys from last September to this July. It includes nearly 12,000 adults and a little bit over 7,000 likely voters. And specifically, I'll be talking a lot about the millennial age group, which is 18 to 34, but a lot of my slides will put the millennial folks in context with some of the other generations, such as Generation X, which are those people aged 35 to 51, baby boomers aged 52 to 70, and the silent generation aged 71 to 88. To give you an idea of the size of these groups, the millennial population accounts for about 33% of the adult population right now. Generation X is at 31%. The baby boomers constitute 27% of the adult population, and the silent generation is about 8%. And so this 1/3 of people being millennials, that's an important component. So dovetailing from what Mark and Karthik were just talking about is this issue of who is registered to vote and who is a likely voter. So what we found in our surveys over this time period is that just over half of millennials actually are registered to vote. And so that's considering that you can do that online, considering all the advances that we've made, just a little bit over half. And when you compare that to nearly 9 in 10 older folks or 7 in 10 baby boomers, that's a significant gap. And when we look at those who we deem likely to vote in elections, we find that just 1 in 4 millennials are likely to vote. And while solid majorities of older generations are likely to vote. And so when you look at this, this plays a large role when it comes to the policies that are being made, especially in California when we have 17 ballot propositions. So millennials make up 33% of the adult population, but just 18% of the likely voter population. Compare that to the silent generation that makes up 8% of the adult population and 14% of likely voters, or the baby boomers, which are 27% of adult population and 39% of likely voters. So there's a disproportionate kind of impact when you look at who's voting. Millennials also make up 43% of non-registered people in our surveys. So as Mark said, the Secretary of State just came out with some new numbers today. About 45% of the state are registered as Democrats, 27% registered as Republican, and 23% registered as independents. Now, when we look at across age groups, millennials are the most likely to be registered as Democratic. However, they're also the most likely to be registered as independent or non-party preference. And so this is important when we look at different policies. It's also important to note that just 15% of millennials are registered as Republican compared to 43% of the silent generation and nearly 1/3 of baby boomers. So we transfer from looking at kind of how they register to actually how they see themselves on an ideological spectrum. Millennials are the most likely to self-identify as liberal, and they're the only group where a plurality identify as liberal. It's notable that about 3 in 10 across generational groups identify as moderate. So, you know, even 3 in 10 millennials identify as moderate. But when you look at the silent generation and the baby boomers, you see a much closer divide between Republicans and, between conservatives and liberals in those cases. So touching upon some of the things that were just discussed, when we look at race and ethnicity across the generations, this is really a stark picture. California, of course, is a majority minority state in the adult population, with non-Hispanic whites making up 43%, Latinos 34%, Asian American and Pacific Islanders 15%, and African Americans 6%. But when you look at this across generational groups, you really see that, you know, the non-white population makes up the bulk of millennials. But then as you move across the generational spectrum, you see that 72% of the silent generation are whites at this time, and the majority of baby boomers are white. So as we move forward, and the millennials kind of move forward, and we have this new generation, you can expect that to just keep sliding forward. So I wanted to kind of, you know, touch upon, it's not just that millennials are different in how they register or how they view themselves, but they're also different on substantive issues. So one issue that we followed in recent years was the concept of the criminal justice system, crime is a problem. Specifically, we asked a question about the treatment of blacks and other minorities in the criminal justice system. And this is pretty stark, where you see overall about 6 in 10 Californians say that that African Americans and other minorities don't receive equal treatment. But when you look at it across generational groups, you really see that, you know, millennials and Gen Xers are similar, but then it really kind of tails off to where the silent generation are divided on this issue. And that's something that I think is stark when you consider that the young people that are actually engaged in these conversations about this, they're not divided. They have a clear vision of how they feel about this. A lot of this is being kind of looked at through a partisan and a racial lens as well, where, you know, 78% of Democrats say that they do not receive equal treatment, compared to just 34% of Republicans. So a lot of what you're seeing here is through the party lens, but also through the racial lens, where, you know, Asian Americans, 60% say they're not treated equally, 92% of African Americans, 64% of Latinos, and 55% of whites. So what you're seeing is the age differences, but it's also being looked at when you see kind of party and race as well. So another issue that has become important on the presidential campaign is the issue of immigrants. And so we've asked a general question about the opinion of immigrants, whether or not they're a benefit or a burden to California. And so traditionally we found majorities saying that Californians are a benefit. This goes back 15 years. In our most recent survey earlier this year, nearly 7 in 10 Californians said that immigrants are a benefit to California. But when you look at it through the lens of the generational status, you really see big differences here, with 78% of millennials compared to 47% of the silent generation, or 62% of baby boomers. And there's a similar pattern when we recently asked about the policy proposal of building a wall across the Mexican border. Very similar pattern with millennials opposing and kind of the same pattern where kind of older folks are a little bit more divided on this issue, as well as the treatment of what should happen to undocumented people in America, should they be allowed to stay if they meet some circumstances, some certain situations, or should they be deported? And so what we found there is, the same thing where millennials and Gen Xers are really stand out on this, and it kind of tails away. So with Californians making so many decisions at the ballot box, as Mark said, 17 this year, involving taxes, involving criminal justice, involving marijuana legalization. I wanted to kind of just show you how differently, in a generic sense, how differently millennials feel about just the size of government, whether or not we should pay higher taxes for more services or pay lower taxes for fewer services. Millennials are the only generational group where a majority say they're willing to pay higher taxes for these more services. And as you can see, it really trails away with a majority and about half in other generations saying that they prefer lower taxes on this. Californians overall and likely voters are divided on this, and they have been in most of our surveys dating back years. This also extends to how Californians feel about a few ballot propositions that we asked about. We asked about the state bond, Proposition 51, the extension of Proposition 30 tax increases to wealthy, Proposition 55, cigarette tax 56, and marijuana legalization. And these same patterns exist there as well. So millennials, while they make up this third of adults, but only 18% of the people that we view as likely to vote, they view these issues much differently. And so, and if we extend it past likely voters, non-registered folks, view these issues in the generic sense differently as well. And so this is kind of where what I'm talking about really meshes well with what Karthik and Mark were talking about. So when we look at presidential vote choice, overall, in our most recent September survey, Hillary Clinton had support of 47%, Donald Trump 31%, Johnson 10%, and Stein 5%. And while Clinton leads across generational groups, what's interesting is that support for Trump actually increases as you go higher in age, and that millennials are the most likely to support minor party candidates, with 32% saying that they're going to choose a minor party candidate. They're actually 2 times more likely than Generation Xers, 3 times more likely than baby boomers, and 5 times more likely than the silents to say that they're going to choose a minor party candidate. And so when you see that, you wonder, is it something to do with their choices? And so what we found is that most likely voters, 56% in our September survey, found that they were not satisfied with their choices of candidates. However, when you look at millennials, 72% say they're not satisfied. They're the least satisfied across all these groups. And if we look back to 2008 and 2012, Californian likely voters in general were much more satisfied across the board. However, even the younger group, 18 to 34-year-olds, which in 2008 and 2012 were not millennials, all of them, but there wasn't this huge difference between these groups. And so what we're seeing here is that this exacerbated just dissatisfaction when it comes to the choices that are being presented to them. And so I want to go ahead and conclude so we can hear these other great folks speak for a little bit. But in closing, it's important to realize that even as we're making it easier to register to vote and potentially to vote, that millennials are less likely right now to register and to vote than older Californians. Millennials are more liberal, but they also are more likely to be registered as independents, which is not as important with the top 2 primary system, but it still does play a role there. There are sizable differences across generational groups on important issues, and these differences expand past just the few issues that I mentioned here. And while Hillary Clinton leads across generational groups, millennials are much more likely than others to choose a minor party candidate. And while most likely voters are not satisfied with the presidential candidate choices, millennials are the least satisfied. And so I think that's kind of a good jumping off point to kind of discuss what's happening when it comes to voter engagement and civic engagement more broadly. So.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? My name is Amy Saucer, and I am a fundraising and communications consultant for social justice and nonprofit organizations. I was an organizer a long time ago, community organizer, and then I realized that someone had to raise the money and raise the consciousness to make that work happen and make it successful. So that's what I do now. I'm here today wearing two hats. One is I'm a consultant with the Funders Alliance of San Bernardino and Riverside counties, which Margarita Luna is part of. I also work with Advancement Project California, which Karthik referenced, and I was part of working on the report that he was talking about called Unequal Voices. I have one copy of the executive summary if you want to look at it. So I'm really glad to be here today and to talk with you all. I wanted to introduce our panel and also to say, unfortunately, Reverend Sam Casey was not able to join us tonight. He had a last-minute emergency, and so we have two of our participants still here. First, Tom Dolan is the executive director of the Inland Congregations United for Change, more easily said ICUC. Tom has worked on community organizing efforts in Latin America and the US for more than 30 years, so he's not a millennial. Neither am I. With ICUC, and they work in both Riverside and San Bernardino counties, Tom has led efforts to build youth civic engagement, improve high school graduation rates, expand healthcare coverage for families, and address the air pollution caused by the railroads. He's also a professor of community organizing at Pitzer College, so he's definitely an expert, both in his professional life and as an academic. Mitzi Perez is with us, and I think she probably is a millennial.
Yes.
Yeah. She's the program and development organizer with the Inland Empire Immigrant Youth Coalition. Mitzi has lived in the Inland Empire since she was 5, when her family migrated here from Guatemala. She's been organizing with IEIYC since 2012. She serves as a steering committee member for the Inland Coalition for Immigrant Justice, and also with the California Immigrant Youth Justice Alliance. It's a lot of words, but you can see a pattern of her interest. She's dedicated to efforts that are crucial to the undocumented identity and to work in solidarity with Black, Muslim, LGBTQIA, and other communities that are the most marginalized. Mitzi is also now a student at UCR, and she was very excited to be presenting today. So we have 30 minutes for this panel. We wanted to give both Tom and Mitzi a chance to talk about their organizations, what they do, and specifically what they do regarding youth engagement and civic participation. So Tom, do you want to go first?
Sure. So we at ICUC started working especially with youth. We've been around for about 25 years, and we do community organizing. And we're part of a national organization called the PICO National Network. We're the largest grassroots community organizing effort in the country. We train people in the community to get involved in the issues that impact their daily lives and to build power so that they can exercise influence at the local level, at the regional, statewide, and occasionally at the national level. And ICUC began organizing young people about 12 years ago. And we were founded by congregations, a very diverse group of congregations. And so we started connecting with young people in their congregations and just asking them, what hurts? Where does it hurt? Who wants to do something about it? And what we tapped into was among 15 to 19-year-olds, large groups of young people who had never been asked to exercise any form of leadership, who have never been paid attention to, who have never visited City Hall, have never been to a school board meeting, and whose voices were actually silenced, not just unheard, but systematically silenced through their schools and through multiple systems in the community that work to silence young people's voices, and especially African American and Latino voices in our communities. So we started to train young people. We worked in the city of San Bernardino initially on issues of violence that were impacting young people. Some of the things that youth talked about were fights in their schools, racial violence, and killings. One of our kids in the very early stages of our work, we had youth meeting at congregations, and one of the youth members was killed in a drive-by. And that really sparked young people to get together, and they took hundreds of youth voices to the City Council in San Bernardino, which continues to have that issue. This year so far, there's been 50 homicides, making the city of San Bernardino has the highest homicide rate this year of any city in the United States, including Chicago. At, per capita, the highest. And so young people went to City Hall to call on leaders to invest more in opportunities to prevent violence, to create job opportunities and educational opportunities for youth. And they were silenced. We had more people at that city council meeting back in 2005, I think it was, than they had ever had at a city council meeting in their history. And we had helped to pass a tax which raised $5 million that year, and youth were asking for $1 million of those dollars to be spent on preventative programs for youth, and they were stiffed, I guess, by the police and fire union and city leaders, and left very angry, but also with a sense of their own power. They had mobilized so many people. They were on the front page of the news for a long time, and their group grew so much from that initial action, from just taking action in their city. They grew from a group within a period of 4 months of 6 kids who didn't know what they were going to do to hundreds of teenagers. It's so big that we had to start to organize on high school campuses to address the issue of transportation, communications, some of the logistics of organizing. And they grew to have one youth organizing group at every one of the 6 high school campuses in the city of San Bernardino. And then from there, they grew out into Coachella, Riverside, and Ontario. So in those 12 years, young people have exercised a great deal of leadership and have made significant changes, often in very tough fights at the school board, at city council, across the region. And after a few years, they realized that pure direct action and civic engagement with their elected leaders was not sufficient. And what they needed to do was to get out the vote. And in some cases, to get other people elected. And so in those 12 years, some of those 15-year-olds, now today there's 3 of those, that cohort, that are running different candidate campaigns in the city. One's running for city council in Highland. One's the field manager for a state legislative campaign, and the third is the campaign director for a state assembly campaign. In addition to that, this year, in a multitude of canvassing and phone banking, they will speak with 50,000 voters in the largest volunteer-led voter engagement campaign, and they're supporting 3 propositions that we've been at the table Now, with our little voice from the Inland Empire at the state table in collecting ballots, signatures to put these things on the ballot, registering voters, and now calling voters and getting out the vote. So it's not always, young people don't always have to vote in high percentages. They can get other people to vote. They can run for office. They can go to City Hall. They can change policies. And that's what's happening through our organization. And the many partners that we've built relationships with as we've seen this organization and other organizations turn into what really is a movement of young leaders in this community who are led by immigrant, especially immigrant youth in the community, African American youth in the community, young people of color who are coming out of high schools and colleges and neighborhoods and are really building a solid base of power and a lot of capacity, skills, and knowledge about how to exercise that power locally and now also at the statewide level.
Thank you. Mitzi?
Hi, everybody. So I'm really excited to be here. Not only I just transferred, this is my first quarter here. I'm coming from community college, but also I'm speaking on behalf of my organization and all the work that we're doing in the region and getting the word out. Because a lot of the times we feel that youth are kind of like invisible in the movement, especially undocumented, queer, brown, people of color, Black, Muslim, and all that. So I'm really glad to be here and uplift our voices and say that, you know, we have earned our seat at the table, and it's time, you know, that we show our work and value our work and uplift our work. So I'm part of the Inland Empire Immigrant Youth Coalition, and I started off in 2012, but it was founded in 2010 by queer and women folks, and it really came out of the failure of the passage of the DREAM Act, the federal DREAM Act that would have allowed youth to gain a pathway to citizenship in the United States. And so at that time, youth were kind of fed up of, you know, trying the nice way, trying to meet with legislators, trying to say, you know, it's important to hear our stories, and our communities are, you know, hurting from deportations and all these systems that are put in place to separate our communities. So they started creating chapters statewide to move policy and move changes locally. And so that's when we created our Inland Empire chapter. And what we focus on now is policy advocacy, our organizing, and youth leadership. And so we've been here for 5 years, like official organization, and we focus also on direct services. So I don't know if y'all have heard of DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and for health, advancing justice for our communities regarding a holistic approach of health. So we really just like to focus on, you know, uplifting ourselves and empowering ourselves, because it's different from hearing from what you heard from someone than living their experience of being undocumented, being excluded out of education system, being told that, you know, you can't drive in this country if you don't have a valid document, you can't get a job if you don't have those 9 digits that a lot of people take often for granted. And so we started working within ourselves, and oftentimes that's when conversations happen and changes happen within our own homes, within our schools, within our work, within our own communities. And so now we've grown. I am staff of this organization, but we started off in a Starbucks. We used to just meet and say, what do we want to work on? We don't know what we're doing, but we're fed up with the system, and we're fed up with what we're seeing in our communities. And so now we're part of like different youth statewide coalitions, and we're able to say, you know, this is what I'm hearing in the Inland Empire, but I also know what's going on in Fresno. I also know what's going on in Northern California. I also know what's going on in San Diego and in other states because of the networks that we've built. And it's important to remember that I'm here telling you I can't vote, I'm undocumented, but that doesn't mean I don't have a voice. That doesn't mean I can go out and tell someone, you know, this is what my mom has been in this country for 20 years and she can't even go to the hospital and get services because she doesn't have those 9 digits. And so, you know, we bring so much to this state and to this country, but it's also, you know, not pinning ourselves within each other and throwing other communities under the bus. Like, what is a good immigrant? What is a bad immigrant? Who deserves to have a status in this country? Who deserves to be like paid attention to, and who doesn't? That's also not good, because that's, again, putting us against each other and not focusing on the real root causes that cause everything that we're fighting against. So yeah, I kind of lost my train of thought, but I'm really excited to be here. And, you know, I think that there's a power once you realize the voice that you have. You don't need to know how to, you know, go lobby. You don't need to know how to make a call if you do want to get involved in civic engagement. But all you have to know is that you have a drive and you have a story and you have a passion for something that you want to change. It doesn't have to be immigrant rights. It could be reproductive justice. It could be environmental issues. Like San Bernardino community and Inland Empire at large has the worst air and water quality. So it just if you find something that interests you, you can get involved in many ways. And also knowing the people that are doing the work and uplifting their the efforts that they're doing in this region, because also we're known in the Inland Empire as being, you know, one of the most under-resourced, underfunded, underrepresented counties in statewide. So it's important to always bring it back and say, you know, even if I'm just here as a student and I'm not from this area, learning what's going on and doing your efforts and part of changing something while you're here, and then taking it back home. You can always, everything you learn, you can take it back home and make a difference there. So yeah.
Great, thank you. I wanted to ask Mitzi and Tom to respond to one question. And so I think, you know, we're kind of in the middle of this wild ride of an election, right? And I'm personally kind of obsessed about it. I think a lot of people are. But I wanted to ask, you know, elections are just one way for people to be involved, and it's also a way that, as people have referenced, that not everybody can be involved, not everybody can vote. So I wanted to ask, how can the energy that's been stirred up by this election be carried into sustained engagement, especially by our youth? How do we turn participation now into empowerment over the long term?
You want to start, or? There are ways that we're seeing young people, millennials, who have, many of my students participated and supported the Sanders campaign, and were really engaged in that, and saw an opportunity, what they thought was an opportunity, to put forward some proposals about policy that deeply impact them around climate, around student loans, issues that impact them, and they were many of them were greatly frustrated, but they're still very much looking for avenues and finding avenues to be involved, not only through voting, but through other forms of transformation in their communities. But honestly, I don't think that voting is necessarily the only way or the most important way to sustain and build strong civic engagement for young people, for millennials. I think any form of systemic disruption, of confronting power and learning how that works and how that doesn't work, can be an incredible motivating force for people to find ways to make change. There's some research that's been released fairly recently about the differences between millennials based on race, and some of the ways African American and Latino youth have changed their thinking about how change occurs after the Obama administration. And there's been a considerable shift in how people think change occurs, and whether voting is one of the most important ways to make that happen. And after the first, not because of the Obama presidency, many of a high percentage of young people still support the President Obama, but because what they saw happen and kind of the inability his inability to make the big changes because of other people who are elected and are holding that up. And so there's been a real shift among young people to think that change and to dedicate their efforts to other types of social movements. And where we're seeing young people make an incredible impact in our communities across the country now isn't necessarily at the voting booth, it's in the streets. And it's in protests and demonstrations that are lifting up again, a new civil rights movement and really ideas about the systemic changes that are needed in San Bernardino, in Riverside, in cities all across the country. So this time in this election nationally, when we see a really invigorated racist right that is rising up in this election, and that has some very visible faces, that also is helping to give young people a narrative that is strengthening their commitment to change through other avenues as well as through voting. I'm seeing that, and the frustration that young people, the dreamers, saw when they weren't able to make that change is leading as well to other forms of civic demands and public disruption that is required to really create change. And that's where I see it. So it's combining voter and civic engagement. It's combining the street and the voting booth. It's combining what they're doing in their schools with what they're able to do in their communities, where I see sustainable, meaningful change for young people.
I would like to say that we know a lot about getting involved beside voting because the population we serve can vote. So I would say definitely do your research. We have the internet. There's so many organizations here locally. We have, a regional coalition that's made up over 35 organizations, and there's like faith-based, there's service providers, there's community organizations. So anything you really want to get involved with, it's here. And within that, also getting involved with an organization, you're able to see that a community organization stays true to the values and the community that they serve. So also they have already ties, they've built a network, they've built a trust that they see what the community needs, and oftentimes like ourselves, like we know what we need in a community. So it's more when we are making policy changes and all that, it's important to keep in mind the voices of those that are going to be affected the most. So if you have at the table someone that is undocumented, they're going to know the needs, besides someone that kind of did like that they work but not coming directly from. Also, voting is once every 4 years, at least the general election, but there's a lot of work that comes before and after voting, especially with accountability and all the promises that we're told. And within that too, just because whoever you want, the candidate that you want to win doesn't get the seat, that doesn't mean that the work is over, because then we have to come in and really push the policy and the changes that we want to see. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. And, and there's all this hype when there's like elections coming. There's oftentimes then we bring up like Black Lives Matter, then we bring up immigration. But what about when there isn't elections? There's still people dying. There's still people getting deported and communities torn apart. So it's important to keep that in mind too. And lastly, that, you can really just make a change like at your own home. Millennials can be like open-minded and stuff, but that doesn't mean that my mom is. That doesn't mean that my mom supports gay marriage and like trans issues and pro like Muslim issues. That doesn't mean that outside of my own bubble and my own space and my own school, that doesn't mean that there is still all this hate and racism and oppression. So it's important to change within ourselves, because at least for us, we like to work from the bottom and then up, right? The changes come from the top up, from the top down, but the real change happens on the ground. But just do your research, and there's students. I'm here, so I'm a resource to you all. But if you know someone, if you know your professor, sometimes they do research in the community, so they know what organizations are doing the work that you might want to get involved with. So yeah.
That's great. That's great. And we are actually out of time for the panel. So are we supposed to manage the question and answer? Because we're opening it up, right?
They'll be able to come straight to the mic and ask
Okay, so they requested people come to the mics because they're live streaming, and so the question can be picked up. And I think the questions can be directed to this panel, but anybody else who spoke too.
Definitely. This is on. Can they hear me?
Is that on?
My name is Ipiani Locker. I just want to first say thank you to the panel. This was very insightful, and thank you for the work that you've done and investment of your time. The question I have to both panels, actually, and I'm with California Partnership as well. I definitely have to say that. But the question I have for both panels is, what are some ways that you see of closing the educational and income disparity that we see throughout the Inland Empire, throughout San Bernardino County and Riverside County? Is there any solutions or any ideas that we haven't heard that might make a tangible impact on the youth right now, and to help close those gaps where we all can reach for that American dream still?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So I'll say one thing related to that. Oh, should I?
I think she's a mic, yeah, sorry.
I mean, I'll say just a couple of things on that. And one, it's ironic to say it at a UC, where a lot of, I mean, so UC certainly it's ironic, but also apt, right? So in UC, and especially places like UCR, we have a tremendous number of first-generation students who go to college, and that's great. But when you look at where most Californians get their higher education, it's in the community college system. And there's a lot of research PPIC and others have done to really figure out, are community colleges serving the needs of our population, and how can we improve what community colleges do? It's great to see people who are transferring from a community college, but that doesn't happen, right? And I remember there was a big celebration a couple years ago. Someone shared on Facebook. It's like, Latinos have the highest rate of like entering college. It's like, okay, but how about completing college? Like, that's a big deal. And you see a lot of drop off. And it's not just with Latinos. You have certain Southeast Asian populations like Hmong and Cambodians who are finding that difficulty. So I think what we're finding, a fair number of students are working, and they're working 1 or 2 jobs in addition to trying to complete. And it's really hard to pick up the kind of skills that you would need to be able to do that. The other thing I'll say, just mention briefly, is that there's an effort now in the region to try to figure out, and we're trying to, UCR and other institutions are trying to engage with the Brookings Institution to try to figure out, can we have good jobs that don't require a 4-year college degree? What does that look like? And how can we implement that here? And I think that will be important too, right? Because part of it is getting people a 2 or 4-year college degree, but there's still going to be tens of thousands of people who don't, for whom that is not an option. And so, what kind of good jobs can we create? I think it's an important question. I think we're just in the early phases of trying to figure out an answer.
Are there any other questions?
I would add to that, pass comprehensive immigration reform so that so many in our region, people who can have access to the educational resources and to jobs. And second, in California, we have done a lot, and we have the opportunity to continue to do more to dismantle the system of mass incarceration that is silencing people and keeping people out of jobs systematically based upon race. Those are 2 things that we are able to do. We can pass policies here in California. We can pass Prop 57 so that we stop trying kids as adults and sending kids off to a life of incarceration for crimes that they commit when they're 14 and 15 years old. So there's a lot we can do. That California is really well situated because of the changes that have occurred. We need to pass Prop 55. If we don't, and so everybody, if you can vote in the state of California, you need to vote yes on Prop 55, because in the city of San Bernardino, we're going to lay off 150 teachers if it doesn't pass. And that's going to ripple all across the state, and it's going to impact young people of color. So there's measures that we can take, and so.
Yeah, I can also speak to what you were saying about transfer rate and how they're like, oh, Latinos are transferring. But I remember when one of my last meetings I had with my counselor, they said, wow, you're still here and you're gonna transfer. I'm like, yes, I'm still here. So there's often that like lack of seeing yourself in places because you've never seen someone else done it before, and how that plays into our mental health. And that's something that is also stigmatized in our communities. But also, like, Mount Sac is a great school, but they still have like a 12% transfer rate. And knowing that someone told me, wow, you're still here, like it took me 4 years to get here and I still have a long way to go. But going back on like what your question was, I think investing in community organizations and investing in the education and the future of youth. So there's a difference between like, investing in programs than community-led organizations. Like for example, ourselves, we're starting a undocumented mentorship academy, which is geared towards undocumented youth, high school youth, and based on our experiences and the lack of like support that we've seen growing up in this in the education system, and telling them, we can guide you and show you the ways that how we navigated the system, but also hearing what your needs are now, because it's been I graduated 2009 from high school, but it's different now than what it was back then. So also like listening to the voices that are on the ground, because they're living that experience and they can tell you what they need in their community.
You asked the big question of the night, as far as I'm concerned. So at our institute, we're focused on where the state spends 90% of the taxpayers' money. And so I would look there first. I'd look at getting better results out of our K-12 system. We have too many people who aren't graduating with the skills that they need. And I think while we're spending more money, we're still not spending adequate money on our K-12 system, especially in the school systems that need it most. The place where we spend the second most money, Health and Human Services. I don't need to tell our colleagues here at California Endowment, they're very well aware of the fact too. It's both the health and the social services that go along with that, making sure that people have access to decent health care, have social programs that will lift them out of poverty when they don't have the means otherwise. The correction system in our needs so much work. I mean, we're spending so much money sending people to jail, sending people to prison, ruining lives, ruining communities, and last but not least, higher education, where we're spending a great deal of money, but we need to spend more. And I would also say that in terms of how do we create some of those jobs, we create some of those jobs trying to solve some of the problems we have in regions like the Riverside, San Bernardino area. Some of the clean energy jobs that are going to come our way and should come our way more as we try to deal with climate change. And we're way behind in our transportation infrastructure in this state. I don't need to tell all of you that. I take the first and second worst commute every day to work in the Bay Area. But everywhere in California, we need better infrastructure, and that would create good paying jobs and is very much needed for communities in California.
I think that's the end, right? I believe so.
So I guess I will wrap it up.
Yeah.
This is, well, you guys don't have to leave. I think we're going to have a reception afterwards, but this has been a real treat I mean, again, we're just like starting to not just scratch the surface, but kind of, you pull the thread and you see how the interconnections are. Sometimes that can become overwhelming, and we do this when we talk about policy analysis, that sometimes in other disciplines, people like to keep things very clean, and you just analyze something and you get a clean result. And when you do policy analysis, it's messy. but could also be, I think if that can be built into how we analyze and to see voting and other forms of civic engagement, not just as like civic duty, right? And I mean, and that's fine. I mean, that's kind of one of the ways that you can think about civic education is, you know, it's our civic duty and this is what makes for a healthy democracy, and that's fine. But to see it as interconnected with people's livelihoods, with things like incarceration, with life chances, with health outcomes, then it becomes powerful. And I think that hope holds out hope that people can see how participation actually matters in their lives. And if they don't participate, it could make their lives a lot worse. And I think that could be the antidote to the disappointment over all of the hope and change that people were expecting, is that, you know, it's not over. And if you get out of the fight, if you get out of the game, chances are that a situation that is bad right now could get a lot worse. So I think that, at the very least, should be a motivator for people to stay engaged and get more engaged. But thank you all, and we have a reception outside, so please join us for that.